Somehow it's March, which means it's Women's History Month, which is my personal favorite of the celebratory months, if I may say so. We're living in a very exciting time in literature and in history when the stories of women from decades, centuries, even millennia past that previously went unacknowledged and unheard are being resurrected thanks to the tenacity and the dedication of scholars, historians, and writers who see the value in them and the readers who want to hear them. Women's voices and experiences make up the cornerstone of my reading and writing lives, so what better time to share some artifacts from women's literary history that taught me just how much I did not know. I have 7 books I want to recommend today, ranging from the Middle Ages all the way to the present. These are books I don't see discussed terribly often, although some are more popular than others, and one is a recent release. Before we get into it, it's worth noting that women's history is a vast topic with immeasurable diversity within it, of which this list represents only a teeny tiny fraction. If there's a book you think should have made it into this video, I probably just haven't read it yet, and I can almost guarantee you that it is on my list, so do feel free to leave your own recommendations in the comments. If you've been around my channel for a hot minute, then you probably know how much I love memoir and autobiography. But did you know that the first autobiography in English was written by a woman? Indeed it was, and that was the book of Margery Kempe. I've recommended this book before, but I'm gonna do it again because it's a good one. Margery Kempe was a Catholic mystic born in England in the late 14th century, and she wrote her book via dictation to a scribe because she was illiterate. Shortly after the birth of her first child, Kempe started having visions of and conversations with Christ, and that led her to a life of devotion to God filled with religious pilgrimages and public displays of, shall we say, spiritual ecstasy. Because childbirth seemed to be the catalyst for Kempe's visions, modern psychologists and scholars suspect she had a case of postpartum psychosis and possibly a degree of schizophrenia. And although that is quite likely, I personally think it's more interesting to take a Kempe at her word that she is having divine experiences and encounters rather than try to diagnose her with a condition for which she had no concept. Part of what makes Kempe's autobiography so fascinating is that she does wrestle with the nature of her experiences in a surprisingly modern manner. She does question her sanity, questions whether she's just having delusions, whether she's truly talking to God, or is she being tricked by a devil. She also ends up in battles with both the church and the law, who deemed her preaching as a woman and her public lamentations disruptive and unholy. She then questions whether her actions are truly honoring Christ, and she does come to the conclusion that they are. I recommend the Book of Margery Kempe during Women's History Month for a few reasons. First, for the simple fact that a woman and a mother of 14 children in her 60s at the time of dictation is responsible for English language autobiography as a genre. And I wonder what would the genre have looked like had Kempe not chosen to record her life. But more importantly, the book is an early demonstration of a woman deciding what the narrative of her life is, despite explicit opposition from every authority around her. And that gets to the heart of why I'm opposed to the psychological reading of Kempe, because of how rare it was for a woman at the time to find an outlet for her voice. Who am I to go back in time and speak over her? Ultimately, the Book of Margery Kempe carved out a space for women today to dictate our own narratives, and for that, it deserves a spot on your shelf. Published only a few decades after Kempe's death is the wildcard recommendation of this video, the Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches by Catholic clergyman Heinrich Kramer. Malleus Maleficarum is a treaty published in Germany in 1486 on how to identify and prosecute witches. Yes, really. At the time it was written, the common attitude toward witchcraft in the church was that anyone who believed in witchcraft or magic was suffering a delusion and seduced by a devil. Kramer in his treaty insists that witchcraft is literally real and outlines exactly how he believes one should find and convict witches. So how does one identify a witch according to Kramer? Well, a witch is almost always a woman, and Kramer wants to make that abundantly clear. Witches only travel at night, led by the pagan goddess Diana, so jot that down. They can command lightning to strike men of their choosing, of course. And it goes without saying that they copulate with devils called incubi and then feed babies to those devils. Obviously. And lest I forget, the funniest, but also most telling indicator of a witch, her ability to make the male organ disappear. Like, literally physically remove it from the body with magic. And apparently, some witches were known to keep, and I quote, baskets filled with 20 to 30 organs. And if a man wanted his back, he had to go to the alleged witch and ask nicely. You truly cannot make this shit up. There's some debate among scholars whether the Malleus was consulted during the European witch hunts of the 16th to 18th centuries. It probably was not, but I don't think that really matters because the text itself illuminates so much about the nature of misogyny that we can trace right back down to the present day. Although the text is outrageous and very humorous to read with modern eyes, it portrays an intense fear of what women are potentially capable of, particularly sexually liberated women. The issue is not just that these witches are heretical beings. Kramer is terrified of literal castration and, by extension, emasculation. This idea of the male fear of impotence as the root of misogyny is one that feminist scholars have been repeating for decades now, but seeing it blown out to such a fantastic proportion that a good chunk of medieval clergy and public took seriously really hammers home how deep that fear runs. In short, the Malleus is a wild read, and lucky for us, several translations are in the public domain, so they will be linked down below. Enjoy. And now, a book that would give Heinrich Kramer a stroke and probably make his thing disappear, Surpassing the Love of Men by Lillian Faderman. Preeminent lesbian historian Faderman traces the development of intimacy between women from the Renaissance to the 1980s when it was published. And by intimacy, Faderman doesn't necessarily mean sex. Rather, she subverts the modern idea that affectionate and sensual behavior between women always indicates sexual orientation. Although plenty of times it does, and we do get there. For example, Faderman examines the 18th and 19th century concept of romantic friendship, in which two women would form an intense emotional bond that was often accompanied by things like love letters, physical touch, and even kissing. Although contact maybe was part of some of these relationships, Faderman discusses that it is very difficult to know. Generally speaking, this sort of behavior was considered a normal and natural way to express affection for your friend, and the men in these women's lives found it harmless and even encouraged it. Faderman does an excellent job of illuminating how fortifying emotional intimacy between women is to a woman's life, and this stands in stark contrast to the turn of the century when Freud hops on the scene and these relationships become suspect. And fear not, Faderman does address relationships between women that were explicitly sexual, particularly once she gets to the early 20th century, and also discusses some utterly fascinating characters who were about as openly lesbian as it was possible to be during the time, among them Natalie Barney and Evita Sackville-West. Now at this point, I think it's important to note that Faderman's writing is very much of its time, and she has an understanding of lesbianism that doesn't exactly hold up today, namely that a lesbian lifestyle is one that any woman can choose as a way to reject patriarchy, as opposed to a natural and immutable sexual orientation, just like heterosexuality. For this reason, I kind of go back and forth on whether I actually like Faderman and her work, also because she has a tendency to, kind of counterintuitively, desexualize lesbians and claims that sex is not an important aspect of lesbian relationships. Perhaps that is true for Faderman, I do not know, but I don't really know where she got that from, and in my experience, this does not track. If you've heard of Faderman's work before, you're probably familiar too with her book Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers. It is a history of lesbian life in 20th century America, and I'm not wholeheartedly recommending this one today for the very reason that I think it is worse. That was a horrible description of my reasoning. Let me elaborate. I prefer Surpassing because I do think it is the stronger book because it encapsulates a broader idea of love and connection between women. And because this focuses more on lesbian life specifically through a very outdated concept, it can be easy to kind of discredit Federman in Odd Girls, and you have to work to keep in mind just how much has changed in the, I think it's 35 or so years since it was published. Anyways, Surpassing the Love of Men offers an alternate to women's history that centers their desires and their affection for each other. And I appreciate that it offers an expansive idea of love that we typically overlook nowadays. Gay, straight, male, female, what have you, friendship is very much second fiddle to romantic love. And Federman suggests that all of our lives could be fuller and richer, and women as a class stronger if this were not the case. Regardless of how well some of Federman's ideas hold up 40 years later, both of these books have an immense amount of information in them and are thoroughly well researched, and they're excellent jumping off points for reading more literature by and about women who love women throughout history. But real quick, exciting news! I am now a bookshop.org affiliate, so if any book in this video interests you, you can shop through the link in the description box where all of my recommendations will be organized by video topic. Every purchase at Bookshop supports independent booksellers throughout the country. So shopping through the link not only helps support this channel at no extra cost to you, because I will earn a small commission, but more importantly, helps small booksellers thrive while competing with giant conglomerates. And you get a new book you were going to buy anyway, so it's a win-win-win all around. Thank you so very much for considering. No pressure from me, of course. I just really love Bookshop. It's one of the few companies whose ethos I trust and stand behind, so I've been very much looking forward to sharing this news with you. Anyway, back to the books. Imagine this. It's 1914 and a dial factory just opened up in your town. You've just turned 18 and you've been hired to paint numbers on clock faces with this special glowing paint that's laced with this cool new substance called radium. To get the most precise lines possible, you've been instructed to place the paintbrush in between your lips to create a fine point. The practice strikes you as a bit odd, but that's no matter because the job pays very well, and you can finally afford that pretty new dress in the local boutique. Life feels like a dream, until you notice a pain in your jaw that just won't go away. Such is the story of the Radium Girls by Kate Moore. The book follows the stories of two groups of young women, one in New Jersey and one in Iowa, from their employment at radium dial factories, through their mystery illnesses and early deaths, to their fight for justice in court. So in the early 20th century, the newly discovered radium was big business, put into all sorts of products, including straight-up radium pills, and it was believed to be harmless and even beneficial. Therefore, when all the Radium Girls began having extreme pain and unexplainable ailments, no one initially thought that their unintentional digestion of radium while painting was the cause. When the connection was eventually made, the factory owners refused to take the women seriously because, naturally, they stood to lose a ton of money. Moore does a phenomenal job of bringing these women back to life and displaying their incredible strength and insistence on justice, while charting the progression of corporate corruption and a legal battle for workers' rights that had no real precedent. Moore's writing does verge on the sentimental at times, and she often presumes to know what the women were thinking and feeling. However, given how deeply disturbing the story is, I can kind of forgive that. Plus, Radium Girls was the first book to focus on the women's experiences rather than the court case exclusively, and Moore's goal was to bring the story to the general public who was largely unaware of it, so I do understand why she would include an element of fiction for the sake of making the story more approachable and relatable. The plight of the Radium Girls is one that affects every American working today. Without them, we likely would not have OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and yet it's still one that is not as well known as it really deserves to be. Fair warning, the book includes graphic descriptions of bodies literally falling apart. And I read the audiobook, but I'm fairly sure the physical book includes photos. So don't eat while reading this. And now for something completely different and not at all nauseating. A jury of her peers, American women writers from Anne Bradstreet to Annie Proulx by Elaine Showalter. Showalter is the iconic feminist literary critic who originated the study of women as writers she calls gynocriticism, which is a fantastic word that I only learned recently. Her book is exactly what it sounds like. In it, she traces the history of women writing in America from 1650 to the early 2000s. It includes all the names you already know, your Emily Dickinson, your Flannery O'Connor, Toni Morrison, and more importantly, a ton of names you probably don't. For example, Catherine Sedgwick, who was an early American bestseller, Harriet Wilson, the first African American to publish a novel in North America, and Sarah Teasdale, an often overlooked 20th century lyric poet and one of my personal favorites. For a critic who created her own sect of criticism, Showalter's writing is eminently readable, doesn't have any academic jargon or highly theoretical literary analysis. It's very much a comprehensive survey that I think is suitable both for seasoned classic lit lovers and readers who are maybe new to the classics or literary history in general. Showalter's knowledge of women writers is immense. Like, I envy her. And because a jury of her peers is a survey, we only get a brief overview and analysis of each writer's work. It does leave you wanting more, but that's kind of to be expected of this style of historical survey. This is the kind of book I wouldn't necessarily recommend reading cover to cover, but rather in small bits at a time while you're looking into the writers that she features. Getting through this hefty tome is itself a project, but a fun and worthy one, in my opinion. If you clicked on this video, you're probably familiar with Virginia Woolf's essay, A Room of One's Own, in which she laments the lack of a female literary tradition. Much as I love Woolf, I don't quite agree with her on this point. I do believe there is a women's literary tradition and women's canon. However, it takes a significant amount of time, energy, and resources to unearth it and bring it back into the light that Woolf, writing 80-ish years before Showalter, just didn't have. I just really admire Showalter because she has been doing that work for essentially her whole career, for decades. I believe she's in her 80s right now. She has a similar volume about British women writers called A Literature of Her Own, as well as the book Inventing Herself, Claiming a Feminist Intellectual Heritage that's a cornerstone of feminist theory. I, for one, am always thrilled to discover brilliant creative women from the past whose work is at risk of being forgotten and resurrecting them, and for that mission, A Jury of Her Peers is an excellent choice. Do be forewarned, however, this book will make your TBR increase tenfold. Women and Power, a Manifesto by Mary Beard. Anyone who's studied classics is probably familiar with Beard's work. She's a historian of ancient Greek and Rome, and I think she's best known for her book of Roman history called SPQR. This little manifesto features 2 essays that examine how ancient power structure excluded women and how those structures are still in place today. The first essay focuses on how women's voices were silenced in ancient public life, both literally in politics and symbolically in mythology. Beard goes on to illustrate how women were occasionally able to muster some degree of self-assertion through what little power they had. The myth of Philomela is the primary example here, whose tongue was cut out after her forced encounter with the king Tereus. She was literally physically silenced, but she was able to illustrate the story of the crime on a woven tapestry. The second essay moves more into the modern day and draws parallels between the ancient power structures just discussed and contemporary politics. This book was published in 2018, so Beard is able to discuss both the 2016 election and the burgeoning Me Too movement. I was particularly interested in Beard's argument that during and after the election, the media turned Hillary Clinton into a sort of Medusa figure, you know, the snake, the nasty woman who was ultimately vanquished by the hero that is Donald Trump. If anyone takes that soundbite out of context, I'm going to be real mad. No doubt, Beard could draw similar conclusions about the 2024 election. And I would like her to get on that if she doesn't mind. Conversely, women speaking up about their experiences with SA, even in those cases that can't be prosecuted, are the modern Philomelas weaving their tapestries. On that note, near the end of the book, Beard opens up about her own essay for the first time after many decades. And I give a little warning just because she is fairly explicit and it comes on suddenly. However, the addition of this personal anecdote really coalesces all of the theories that she offered earlier into a visceral demonstration of male power and female silence. And for that reason, I think this is actually the strongest section of the book. The main shortcoming of Women in Power is that it's short, at just over 100 pages, although Beard is aware that she's merely addressing an issue rather than creating solutions. This book could easily be twice or even 3 times as long and much more in depth, and honestly, I'm not sure why Beard or her publishers didn't go that route, because you are left desperately wanting these solutions. Still, Beard leaves us with a compelling question. If in the year 2018 or 2025, women are not full participants in the power structures that be, how then can we redefine power? Although I listed these recommendations in chronological order, I actually recommend starting with this one because that question underlies every other book in this video to some extent in one way or another. Finally, the most recent development in women's history, and realistically the most relevant, You Must Stand Up, The Fight for Abortion Rights in Post-Dobbs America by Amanda Becker. If you're anything like me, you have a hard time understanding politics, meaning the nitty-gritty details of policy, legislation, courts, etc. That's why, for me, the overturning of Roe v. Wade felt like it came out of nowhere. In her book, Becker outlines how it did not, in fact, come out of nowhere, and lays out the steps that led up to the overturning over a period of decades. She also talks to politicians, advocates, and healthcare professionals in the states with the most restrictive abortion laws, such as Alabama, Louisiana, and Kentucky, about how their work has changed and how they plan to move forward. This is the kind of journalism that you'll come away from filled with rage, but significantly more knowledgeable than you were before. Because Becker has a lot of ground to cover, it is data heavy and dense at times. However, I think she does a good job of balancing that out with the more personal stories of people on the ground fighting the good fight, as it were. And that's what I enjoyed most about You Must Stand Up, was the opportunity to hear from activists I probably wouldn't even know were out there otherwise. So I'm in New York, where attitudes about abortion and women's bodily autonomy are very different than states like Alabama. And a lot of stories from out that way aren't necessarily coming over here. One such story that struck me was the activist and educator who is teaching college students how to access abortive medication without raising suspicion. For example, she recommends the students, if they need to, take a pill that won't show up on a blood test. And something like that never crossed my mind, that someone has to think about these details or suffer the consequences. By the same token, I appreciate the reminder that states are not monoliths, and there are indeed people fighting for women's rights and working tirelessly for justice all across the country. What's kind of wild about this book, though, is that although it was released in September of 2024, it already feels a little outdated, and that's no fault of Becker's, but entirely because the past, 6, 7-ish months have felt like 3 years. Regardless, You Must Stand Up ends with a message of hope and a call to action. Women's history is always still in the making, and together we are not nearly as powerless as individually we might feel. And there we have it, 7 lesser-known books on women's history that were formative and informative reads for me, and I really hope they can be for you as well. Once again, I would love to hear any recommendations that you want to share, and also if you've read any of the books I featured here, what were your thoughts? Thank you so very much for spending your time with me today. If any of these books sparked some interest, do consider giving the video a little like to help support the channel. As always, I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I will see you in the next one.